Well, good afternoon, Dr. Lyon. Today I will be doing a character study for you on the character of Hannah found in 1 Samuel, in the first couple chapters of 1 Samuel. And some of the questions regarding Hannah would be, how does Hannah contribute to the overarching plot of the narrative? And this plot narrative that we're going to be looking at is found through 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 7. That was the reading for this assignment, and so that's the plot, the outline. And so, what are Hannah's contribution to this overarching plot? And I think in order to first look at Hannah's contribution to this, we need to look at the historical context of where we find Israel in 1 Samuel, because this was right after the historical period of the Judges, which was where Israel found themselves rebelling against God and hardship coming upon them, and then God would raise up a judge to bring the people back to God, or to deliver the people, and then the people would find themselves in a state of good times in obedience with God, and then they would fall away again, and so God would rise up another judge, and so there's this cycle going on. And so that's what we find out that in 1 Samuel, we see that God, he's starting to establish his people. He wants to establish them a people who will seek him and who will serve him with their whole heart. Excuse me. With their whole heart. He's tired of people doing whatever they want and with no reverence or fear of God, because that's what had been happening. People were doing whatever was right in their own hearts. And so here God's trying to establish, he's going to raise up people who want to follow him wholeheartedly. And so he does that through Hannah. She's an example of someone who seeks God with their whole heart. Hannah contributes by showing how God responds to those who are in a lowly position and yet humble themselves further and seek God for help. As I read in the Lexham Bible Dictionary, Hannah brings her desire for a child to God in persistent prayer, with a radical hope that God will grant her desire of a child. And then in return, if she's given this child, she promises to return this child back to God in service to God. And so this vow we see was made before the Lord in chapter 1, verse 11, and it reads, "O Lord," this is her prayer, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will you give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. And no razor shall come upon his head." And so we see her actions are described as that she weeps in anguish because she has no offspring, and she pours out her soul before the Lord, and she describes herself as a maidservant of God. And so this title is a title of humility for a woman in a position of lower authority or statue. And this definition comes out of the Bible Sense lexicon. And so here we see that Hannah's describing herself as a maidservant. So she's acknowledging her lower position, her lower statue, especially before God. And so she comes to God with humility, but in hopes that he will respond to her, knowing and believing that he can. And so in these first couple chapters, Hannah is a dynamic character. Her importance lies in her location within the larger context, because her grief is also bearing witness to the grief of Israel, as does her prayer for a better future. And this thought was first thought of through the Lexham Bible Dictionary. As I was reading that, they state this, that her importance is in the location because she bears witness to the grief of Israel and her prayer for a better future. And I agree with that Hannah is an example of someone who is grieving and yet believes that God can grant a better future. And so I also learned from the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary that Hannah's name means grace. And so she's this picture of God granting grace not only to her, but the grace that he wants to grant to the nation of Israel. And so she represents how God deals with people who are humble before him and seeking to serve him obediently. We also see through her dynamic character, we see that she laments about her situation, but she prays to God. And then when God answers her prayers, we see that she rejoices, and that she's also faithful to the promise that she made, that she vowed to give this son back to the Lord if he granted her a son. And we see that she's faithful to that she's a faithful wife and also a faithful mother. And so as we look at Hannah's interaction with other characters, her state of interacting is always in a humble state. With her husband, she was quiet when he was trying to counsel her or console her, but she also wept over her lack of children. She was also being provoked by her husband's other wife, and yet she responds in lament and the quietness of her soul to the Lord. We don't see her acting out to other people, but she remains in a humble state. With Eli, the priest, she showed respect and reverence, explaining her situation and how she only wants the Lord to answer her prayers. Here she was in such anguish and crying out that Eli thought she was drunk, and yet she responds to Eli saying, "No, I'm not a wicked woman. Don't think of me as that. Rather, I am crying out to the Lord in my anguish." And she wins his favor as well through her humble state. And then when she's dealing with God, she is humbling herself, calling herself a maidservant, and acknowledging that God alone is the one who has the power to grant her a child. And so through all of this, I believe that the author is using Hannah to impact the reader, to show that God does hear and responds to the heartfelt cries, and when we come to him out of faith and belief that he is listening and he has the power to act. It shows that God sees those in lowly positions and that we don't have to come to him with anything other than a sincere heart. Sometimes we think we have to come to God and bring him something, and yet here we see Hannah just lowers herself, humbles herself before God, and cries out to him and asks for his help and for his power to work in her life. And I think that that impacts us as readers, because we can relate with that. What can we bring to God? And yet here we see Hannah comes with a sincere and a humble heart, believing that God can restore her and can grant her favor, and it's through that God acts. We also see that the author uses Hannah to describe who God is. In the second chapter, in verses 1 and 2, we see Hannah's prayer, and Hannah praises God and speaks to him. And then in verses 3, she addresses those who oppose God. And I see this thought, I found this thought through a handbook on the first book of Samuel. And we see that God is making himself known through Hannah, and that a relationship is not available only to her, but to all who come to God humbly and in faith. Through Hannah, we see that God is weighing the actions of not just her, but of everyone. She says in the third verse that God is weighing every thought, every action. And we know that this is true throughout other examples in this chapter. We see Eli and his sons Hophni and Phinehas. God was weighing their actions as well. And so there are a lot of different characters in this section of 1 Samuel 1 through 7. But here, looking at Hannah, we see that she's a good example of somebody who seeks God, humbles themselves before God, in obedience to God, but also in belief that God can help those who seek him. So, that's what I have for the character study on Hannah. Thank you.